exciting. I won't take any more time. I'm just invite everyone to welcome you back for this, and also to thank you for the beautiful seminar that's going on.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So thanks very much, Chris, and welcome back to all my students. It feels like we only saw each other just recently. Anyway, we've been having a really rich seminar on questions of the border and ways to complicate this notion and how to think beyond a kind of line conception that separates me or us from them and not me. So we've been reading Achille Mbembe and Gloria Anzaldúa, Trinh Minh Ha, and other folks. And so we're going to bring together some of the themes that we've been talking about as well in terms of talking about using quantum field theory to really upend certain kinds of patterns of thinking. And this is part of a larger project, as we've been talking about, that I've been doing in a certain kind of sense for most of my adult life, really because my PhD is in theoretical particle physics and quantum field theory, and I'm finally getting to do the quantum field theory part of agential realism. And that project very much is implicated in the construction of the atom bomb, and therefore ways in which I'm looking for, as part of the project, ways in which the violence of colonialism and militarism and racism is actually inside the equations of quantum field theory. And at the same time, in the deconstructive dynamics that is the indeterminacy that's part of the quantum openings, different kinds of openings that exist within that for thinking otherwise. So this is just another installment of this ongoing project that I've been working on. And I actually want to begin not with my own slideshow, but with the a brilliant poem, video poem, by Marshall Island poet Kathy Jetnell Kitchener, and I'd like to thank her for permission to show this.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless, swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath looming coconut trees, beds of watermelons slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Iroij chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you one by one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became crater, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history. Immovable, unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruit, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here is a story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Ledao, a piece of her shell anointed with power, a leathery green fragment hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Ledao the power to transform into anything, into houses and trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire. He almost burned us alive. I am looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's the story of another shell, anointed with power. Ledao used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves. While the boy cried, Ledao laughed and laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is the story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions. Hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
Actually, before I start, I wanted to say something about, we've been talking in the class about different kinds of uses of poetics, and I've talked about the fact that one of the things that has happened for me in my writing is that in attempting to be rigorous to give over what the equations of quantum field theory are saying to the best of my ability, I've needed to use poetics to be as rigorous as possible. And so one of the things that I do actually is employ a slash in my writing. So I'll have something like im/possible. And the slash doesn't mean, either or both. It has to do with what we've been talking about, this dynamics of interaction, which is a cutting together apart. So it's when I say impossible, because I don't want to keep saying the slash, I'll speak it that way. Impossible, you're supposed to hear the cutting together apart of possibility and impossibility. All right? So, okay. Let us begin again for the first time at the end. At an island that has been given the colonizing title, the end of the earth. This island has been dubbed both an Edenic paradise and the most toxic place on Earth. Here at the crossroads between nuclear and climate catastrophes is the end of the Earth and the beginning. It is here that we find a dome. The dome is located in the Marshall Islands on a chain of islands called Eniwetok Atoll. Few Americans have heard of this atoll. though some may recall something or other about Bikini. Bikini Atoll is associated in the American imagination, if at all, with the kind of first and only thermonuclear bomb blast. But it was neither the first nor the only one. The particular thermonuclear hydrogen bomb test that got so much fanfare was 1,000 times the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The eerie sci-fi cloud of the Bravo test lingers, though the fact that it was one of 23 nuclear bombs exploded at Bikini has long faded. It's not that the 67 nuclear and thermonuclear bombs that the US detonated on the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958 have been kept secret. On the contrary, unlike the Manhattan Project, much was made of this Cold War spectacle that turned the island nation into a laboratory and a display case for flexing military muscle. But the extent of the violence and the ongoingness of what Winona LaDuke calls radioactive colonialism is one of the few things radioactive that has not been absorbed. Or rather, like other forms of colonialism, the temporality of radioactive colonialism is not of a past that is past, or even decays with time, but rather an ongoingness that is present and that scrambles the imperialist temporal ordering of past, present, future. The majority of the 67 nuclear bombs, 43 of them were exploded on Eniwetok. 4 of Eniwetuk's 40 islands were completely vaporized by thermonuclear bomb tests. 2 of the nuclear bomb blasts left 2-kilometer-wide craters on the edge of Ruinant Island. In the late 1970s, the US government, in the process of washing its hands of the radioactive mess they left in the Marshall Islands, did a rudimentary cleanup. 4,000 US servicemen were deployed to the Marshall Islands to do the dirty work, which included putting hundreds of pieces of plutonium, the debris of a detonation gone wrong, into plastic bags and throwing them into the crater, along with other nuclear debris from the tests. This constituted a cleanup of approximately 0.8% of the total radioactive waste. The servicemen had no protective gear or education about handling nuclear waste. The crater is mostly made of coral, a very porous material, which was then covered over by a dome of concrete. Alcin Keelan, climate change activist and a native of Bikini Atoll, points out that the dome sits at the juncture, a crossroads between 2 great destructive forces. The dome, he says, is the connection between the nuclear age and the climate change age. For the Marshall Islands are at the forefront of climate change. A 60-centimeter increase in sea level by the end of the century may inundate 3/4 of the country. According to USGS data, many atolls in the Marshall Islands will be uninhabitable within decades. In a 2014 New York Times editorial, A Pacific Isle, Radioactive and Forgotten, Columbia University climate change scholar Michael Gerard writes, quote, in 1982, a US National Research Council task force warned that, quote, the dome might be breached by a severe typhoon, but a 2013 report sponsored by the US Department of Energy saw no reason to worry. Catastrophic failure of the concrete dome, it said, and instantaneous release of all its contents into the lagoon will not necessarily lead to any significant change in the radioactive dose delivered to the local population. The reason? The reason, according to this report, was that the radiation inside the dome was dwarfed by the radiation in the sediments in the lagoon. Thus, a leak from the dome would be, quote unquote, no added threat because it is dirtier on the outside than on the inside. Gerard continues, Ruinant Dome embodies injustices in many ways. The fact that all these weapons were exploded there, the fact that plutonium was left behind, The fact that the US military workers who worked there to clean up a failed plutonium bomb have not been compensated. And very importantly, the fact that the entire nation is endangered by sea level rise, which is caused mostly by the greenhouse gas emissions of the major emitting countries, of which the US was historically number one. These are an accumulation of injustices, unquote. But we might add further to Gerard's list. First, perhaps the fact that the Marshallese have been and continue to suffer from very high rates of cancer as a result of the radioactive fallout. The fact of severe birth defects, that the Marshallese women have given birth to what they call jellyfish and grapes, as they themselves have described it. The fact that the Marshallese have the second highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world as a result of eating Spam and other canned food for decades, after being told that the fish and fruits of their island were too contaminated to ingest. And the fact that the Marshallese, who have been allowed by the Compact of Free Trade Association Treaty to move to the US and work without green cards, but without citizenship, are currently the most impoverished ethnic group in the United States. This section of the paper is called The Politics of Matter, the Matter of Politics. Matter fell from grace during the 20th century. It became mortal. Very soon after that, it was murdered, exploded at its core, torn to shreds, blown to smithereens. The smallest of the smallest bits, the heart of the atom, was broken apart with a violence that made the earth and the gods quake. In an instant, in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, the distance between heaven and earth was obliterated. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. There is a time when matter stood outside of time, but in the intervening years between the two world wars, physicists broke with a more than 1,000-year-old tradition inherited from the Greeks and placed matter in the hands of time. Quantum field theory, a mixture of quantum theory, of quantum mechanics, that is, and relativity and field theory, was responsible for this radical change in the order of things. Physicists began working on quantum field theory in the late 1920s, but quickly ran into difficulties, most seriously the so-called infinities problem, which was not resolved before the war. The war effort interrupted the development of the theory, at least in the West, because many of the same physicists who were hard at work on quantum field theory were called on to work on and take the lead in the development of military technologies. This, as we've talked about in class, is not a coincidence. Nuclear physics developed alongside and inside, that is within, quantum field theory, and many of the top physicists around the world were working on quantum field theory and nuclear physics. Skills, techniques, approaches to cracking hard problems, and more were traded back and forth between military research and the most abstract efforts in physics. In significant ways, the war effort for physicists around the globe was continuous with work in pure theoretical physics. Tracing the entanglements of the construction of a quantum field theoretic account of nature and the development of a weapon that unleashed nature's fury goes to the core of this project. But for now, I will focus on exploring the radical possibilities that exist within the theory for exploding the structures of violence that not only resulted from the theory, but were integral to the practices of theorizing. If quantum physics provides useful conceptual tools for understanding the politics of matter and the matter of politics in the nuclear age, it is because quantum physics and the atomic bomb are directly and profoundly entangled. The theory and the bomb inhabit one another and help constitute each other. Just like the ontology or hauntology it suggests, quantum theory is shot through with the political. This is perhaps why it might be helpful. This next section is going to bring us to doing a bit of quantum field theory. The subtitle is Life and Death, Time Being, and the structure of nothingness. During this time, the nature of time and being were together remade. No longer an independent parameter of relentlessly marching forward into the future, time is neither a continuum nor a series of discrete moments that follow in succession. Time is diffracted, imploded, exploded in on itself. Each moment is made up of a superposition of all moments, differently weighted and combined in their specific material entanglement. And directly linked to this indeterminacy of time is a shift in the nature of being and nothingness. Newtonian physics subscribes to the Democritean notion that nature has but two elements, atoms and the void. In Newtonian physics, the void is mere nothingness. It is that which literally doesn't matter. The void provides a backdrop against which matters, namely matter, can be mapped in space and time, where space and time are absolute, universal, fixed, homogeneous coordinates that have their existence independently of all matter and of each other. And matter, discrete bits of substance, are immutable. These bits can move about and change their motion according to the application of forces that are external to the bits of matter. Newton's equations are designed to account for their motion. Motion unfolds predictably against the backdrop of absolute space while time marches forward without any regard for anyone or anything. In this way, the very nature of change is theorized as matter in motion, where the movement is determined by the whims of external forces. 20th century physics challenges these notions of space, time, matter, and the void. According to quantum field theory, matter is not some givenness that preexists its interactions, and the void is not determinately empty. Indeed, matter is always already caught up with the indeterminate dynamics of the no-thingness of the void. At the core of quantum field theory is the indeterminacy of time being. And this gives rise to the fact that nothingness is not empty, but on the contrary, it is flush with the dynamism of indeterminacy of time being, the play of non-presence, of non-existence. As a result of a primary ontological indeterminacy, the void is not nothing, while not being something, but rather it is a desiring orientation towards being becoming, innumerable imaginings of what might yet be, have been. Nothingness is material, even in its non-presence. So-called virtual particles are the quanta of the indeterminate play of nothingness. They are and are not there as a result of the energy-time indeterminacy relation. Virtual particles are quantized indeterminacies in action. Virtual particles are not present and not present, but they are, in any case, material. In fact, most of what matter is virtual. Virtual particles do not traffic in a metaphysics of presence. They do not exist in space and time. They are ghostly non-existences that teeter on the edge of the infinitely fine blade between being and non-being. Virtuality is admittedly difficult to grasp. Indeed, this is its very nature. Virtuality is the material wanderings of nothingness, where every possible path is tested out. Virtuality is the ongoing thought experiment the world performs with itself. Indeed, quantum field theory tells us that the void is an endless exploration of all possible couplings of virtual particles, a scene of wild activities. The quantum vacuum is more like an ongoing questioning of the nature of emptiness than anything like a lack. The ongoing questioning of itself, and indeed of it and self, is what generates, or rather is, the structure of nothingness. The vacuum is no doubt doing its own experiments with non-being, indeterminacy, is not the state of a thing, but an unending dynamism. The fact that the void is not empty, a mere lack or absence, matters. The question of absence is surely as political as that of presence. When has absence ever been an absolute givenness? Is it not always a question of what is seen, acknowledged, and counted as present, and for whom? The void, a much valued apparatus of colonialism, a crafty, insidious imaginary, a way of offering justification for claims of ownership in the discovery, so-called discovery of quote-unquote virgin territory. The notion that quote-unquote unintended, uncultivated, uncivilized spaces are empty rather than plentiful has been a well-worn tool used in the service of colonialism, racism, capitalism, militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and scientism. This next section is called Quantum Field Theory, a Touchy Subject. You guys know where I'm going. Both birth and death, it turns out, are not the sole prerogative of the animate world. So-called inanimate beings also have finite lives. Quote, particles can be born and particles can die, explains one physicist. In fact, it is a matter of birth, life, and death that requires the development of a new subject in physics, that of quantum field theory. Quantum field theory is a response to the ephemeral nature of life, unquote. When it comes to quantum field theory, it is not difficult to find trouble, epistemological trouble, ontological trouble, a troubling of kinds, of identities, of the nature of touching and self-touching, of being and time, to name a few. It is not so much that trouble is around every corner, according to quantum field theory. It inhabits us, and we inhabit it, or rather, trouble inhabits everything and nothing, the matter and the void. How does quantum field theory understand the nature of matter? Pace Democritus, particles do not take their place in the void, rather they are constitutively inseparable from it. And as we just saw, the void is not vacuous. It is a polyrhythmic, structured nothingness, a dynamic play of the indeterminacy of non-being. The void, or what quantum physicists call the vacuum, is an extravagant, inexhaustible exploration of virtuality, where virtual particles are having a field day performing experiments in being and time. So let us start with an electron, one of the smallest particles. According to classical physics, it is a point particle, a particle of 0 dimensions and devoid of structure. So that's what I'm showing in the top diagram. It's just an electron hanging out there, and time goes on. So that's why the line instead of a point. Now, even the smallest bit of matter causes all kinds of difficulties for quantum field theory. For as a result of the time being indeterminacy, the electron does not exist as an isolated particle, but is always already inseparable from the unruly activities of the vacuum. In other words, the electron is always already interacting with the virtual particles of the vacuum in all possible ways. For example, an electron will emit a virtual photon, the carrier of the electromagnetic force, and then reabsorb it. So that's the middle diagram here. This possibility is understood as the electron electromagnetically interacting with itself, that is, touching itself, since touch is but an electromagnetic interaction, and photons are the quanta of the electromagnetic field. So part of what an electron is then is this self-energy interaction. But this single exchange of a photon with itself is this single exchange of a photon with the electron exchanging a photon with itself is not a process that happens in isolation either. All kinds of more involved things can and do occur in this frothy virtual soup of indeterminacy that we ironically think of as a state of pure emptiness. For example, in addition to the electron exchanging a virtual photon with itself, that is touching itself, it is possible for the virtual photon that is emitted by the electron to enjoy other interactions with itself before it gets reabsorbed. So for example, the virtual photon can metamorphize or transition and change its very identity, like the bottom diagrams are supposed to illustrate. So for example, an electron can emit a virtual photon that then transforms into a virtual electron-positron pair that subsequently annihilate each other and morph back into a single virtual photon before it's reabsorbed by the electron. And a positron, as we talked about in our discussions, is the electron's antiparticle. It has the same mass but the opposite charge of the electron and goes backwards in time. So even in a sense, this is allowed because of the indeterminacy of time being. So those are just a couple of the diagrams, and then there's the gesture of and so on. And this so on is a shorthand for an infinite set of possibilities involving every possible kind of interaction with every possible kind of virtual particle it can interact with. That is, there is a virtual exploration of every possibility. And this infinite set of possibilities, or an infinite sum over all possible histories, entails a particle touching itself, and the particle that transmits the touch transforming itself, and then that touching itself, and the transforming and touching of other particles that make up the vacuum, and so on ad infinitum. A pansexual alchemical orgy of sorts. So not everything is possible given a particular interaction, but an infinite number of possibilities exist. So every level of touch, then, is itself touched by all possible others. Particle self-interactions entail particle transitions from one kind to another in a radical undoing of kinds, queer transformations or transmutations. Hence, the electron is an encounter with the infinite alterity of the self. Matter is an infolding, an involution. It cannot help touching itself. And in this self-touching, it comes into contact with the infinite alterity that it is. Polymorphous perversity raised to an infinite power. Talk about a queer trans intimacy. So what is being called into question here is the very nature of the self. And in terms of not just being, but also time. That is, in an important sense, the self is dispersed or diffracted through time and being. Commenting specifically on the electron self-energy interaction, the physicist Richard Feynman, who won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to developing quantum field theory, as well as being a chief scientist who helped engineer the Manhattan Project, expressed horror at the electron's monstrous nature and its perverse ways of engaging with the world. Quote, "Instead of going directly from one point to another, the electron goes along for a while and suddenly emits a photon. Then, horrors, it absorbs its own photon. Perhaps there's something immoral about that, but the electron does it," unquote. This self-energy, self-touching term has been labeled a perversion of the theory because the calculation of the self-energy contribution is infinite, which is an unacceptable answer to any question about the nature of the electron, such as what is its mass or its charge. So apparently touching oneself or being touched by oneself, the ambiguity, undecidability, indeterminacy may itself be a key to the trouble, is not simply troubling, but a moral violation, the very source of all the trouble. The problem of self-touching, especially self-touching the other, is a perversity of quantum field theory that goes far deeper than I can touch on here. But the gist of it is this. This perversity that is at the root of an unwanted infinity that threatens the very possibility of calculability gets renormalized. That's the technical term. So why should we expect anything less than renormalization? So how does this happen? So physicists conjectured that there are two different kinds of infinities or perversions involved in this case, one that has to do with self-touching and another that has to do with nakedness. That is, in addition to the infinity related to self-touching, there is an infinity associated with the bare point particle That is, with the metaphysical assumption we started with, that there is only an electron that is undressed. It's the bare electron, and it's somehow separate from the void. So there's something wrong with that assumption, which is also then a perversity. So this nakedness, or what is called technically as a term, the bare electron, is also a perversion of the theory. So renormalization then is the systematic cancellation of infinities, these two types of perversions canceling one another to give something that is much better behaved and finite. Another way to talk about this cancellation idea is that the infinity of the bare point particle cancels the infinity associated with the cloud of the virtual particles. In this way, the bare point particle is dressed, again, another technical term, by the vacuum contribution, that is the cloud of virtual particles. So the dressed electron, that is the electron in drag, and that's one contribution. That's the only interpretive contribution, actually, in this section. The rest of the language is the way that you get taught it. So anyway, the dressed electron, that is the physical electron, is thereby renormalized, that is made normal or finite. So renormalization is the mathematical handling or taming of infinities. That is, the infinities are subtracted from one another, yielding a finite answer. Mathematically speaking, this is a tour de force. Conceptually, it is a queer theorist's delight. It shows that all of matter in its essence, and of course that is precisely what is being troubled here, okay, is a massive overlaying of perversities, an infinity of infinities. So to summarize, quantum field theory radically deconstructs the ontology of classical physics. The starting point ontology of particles and the void of foundational reductionist essentialism is undone by quantum field theory. According to quantum field theory, perversity and monstrosity lie at the core of being, or rather it is threaded through it. All touching entails an infinite alterity, so that touching the other is touching all others, including the self, and touching the self is a matter of touching the stranger within. Even the smallest bits of matter are an unfathomable multitude. Each individual always already includes all possible interactions with itself through all possible virtual others, including those and itself that are non-contemporaneous with itself. That is, every finite being is always already threaded through with an infinite alterity, diffracted through being and time. Indeterminacy is an undoing, an unslash-doing of identity that unsettles the very foundations of being and non-being. The void in its dynamics of indeterminacy marks an interruption, an undoing of self. The outside, the void, allegedly surrounding all matter, is constitutively inside matter itself. And this brings us to the questions of hospitality. Questions of colonialism and hospitality are thoroughly entangled, and nuclear colonialism is no exception. At a time when Western countries settled through invasion and colonization, erecting fences and criminalizing refugees, fleeing for their lives from their home countries, and in many cases, of course, because of Western imperialist policies, and hospitality itself is considered a crime, as in the recent sentencing of U.S. citizens who left water in the desert for migrants attempting to cross the southern border of the so-called United States, and the Stansted 15 who were convicted for intervening in the forced return of refugees, and the arrest of the captain of Sea-Watch 3 for rescuing 40 migrants in danger of drowning. These are all evidence of the entanglement of colonialism and hospitality in the news now every day. This is not something new, but rather constitutes an ongoing violence that condenses around questions of hospitality. And while the inclination to insist on absolute hospitality may be a ripe temptation, it is crucial that we remember that hospitality has also been a mechanism of invasion and conquest. In an important report on the fallout, that is the hardship, pain, suffering, and damages that resulted from the U.S. nuclear weapons tests on the Marshall Islands, the authors of Consequential Damages of Nuclear War, the Rongelap Report, written by Barbara Rose Johnston and Holly M. Barker, write, "The Rongelap Report tells the story of a myriad of changes that occur to a community whose lives and lands are heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. In 1946, after evacuating the people of Bikini and nearby atoll communities in the Marshall Islands, the United States detonated 2 atomic weapons, the same type of bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. In 1947, the United Nations designated the Marshall Islands a U.S. trust territory. Over the next 11 years, this U.S. territory played host to another 65 atmospheric, atomic, and thermonuclear tests. The largest of the tests, codenamed Bravo, was detonated on March 1st, 1954. This 150 megaton hydrogen bomb was purposefully exploded close to the ground. It melted huge quantities of coral atoll, sucking it up and mixing it with radiation released by the weapon before depositing it on the islands and inhabitants in the form of radioactive fallout." So, unquote. There's so much to talk about already just in this paragraph. Just for starters, there's the stunning temporality of the establishment of a trust whereby the UN designates the US as trustee of the Marshall Islands after the US exploded 2 nuclear bombs there in 1946. But for now, I'd like to focus on a phrase that stands out for its irony and leaves the reader tripping at the threshold of its invitation to examine it further. The phrase is "played host." Quote, "Over the next 11 years, this US territory played host." Okay? This is not insignificant phrasing. This playing at being a host, not being a host, but playing at it, seems to point to a troubling of the legitimacy of being the host. Indeed, it seems that it is in the very nature of the idiom itself, playing host. It seems to call the question on actually being a host. Who is actually a host? What is a host? So tripping over the threshold of this phrasing, we cannot not ask, who is hosting whom here? Zooming out a bit, but staying with this same uncanny sentence, what cannot go without notice is the horrifying nature of this particular welcome. Now, I'm going to read the line again. This U.S. territory played host to another 65 atmospheric, atomic, and thermonuclear tests, unquote. In other words, on a literal reading, the host was a territory given to one entity by another entity to whom it didn't belong. The territory in question was legally designated as belonging to the U.S. by an institution dealing in international law. And who were the guests? They were none other than another 65 nuclear and thermonuclear bombs. Talk about hospitality. So the idiom of playing host here not only calls the question of who it is that is doing the hosting, by proxy, the U.S., but also points to the performative nature of the ghastly repetitions of incalculable violence that constitute the host as host. Hence, the notion of playing at hosting harkens to the multiple and compounding injustices, or rather a superposition of injustices, that result from this so-called hospitality, including, but not limited to, the permanent uninhabitability, that is, the made inhospitable nature of the very islands that were interpolated into this role. Clearly, the reference to this unconventional and explosive relationship of alleged hospitality, or indeed hostility, which, as Derrida notes, is etymologically inside the very definition of hospitality, begs a very important question that takes us to the ethical core of relations among entities, whether individuals or nation states. What is the basis of playing host? What are the conditions of possibility for hosting? Indeed, does not the very notion of hosting, of being a host rather than playing host, entail some privileged relation to place, to a specific place where one welcomes guests? And what constitutes an ethical and just relation of hospitality? Through a deconstructive consideration, Derrida demonstrates the impossibility of hospitality. In offering unconditional hospitality, the host gives up sovereignty and becomes hostage to the guest, who becomes the host's host. Indeed, in the case of the Marshall Islands and other tropical paradises where hospitality is extremized and exoticized, it is this very tension between sovereignty and hospitality that is at issue. And as oceanic scholar Paul Lyons points out, under colonial relations, it is the host who is under siege. And furthermore, for Derrida, the difficulty is not solved by turning to conditional hospitality, for conditional hospitality necessarily operates through exclusion, thereby defying its own hospitality. Hence, hospitality is an aporia. So Derrida makes an important distinction between questions of justice from those of law, aligning the former with unconditional hospitality and the latter with conditional hospitality. He points out that hospitality figures in the classic or law-governed conditional sense is always already a matter of violence and injustice. Derrida explains, no hospitality in the classic sense without sovereignty of oneself over one's home. But since there is no hospitality without finitude, sovereignty can only be exercised by filtering, choosing, and thus excluding and doing violence. Injustice, a certain injustice, and even a certain perjury begins right away from the very threshold of the right to hospitality, unquote. Hence, while the classic sense of hospitality raises vital questions of place and the relation to place as well as that of sovereignty, which are no doubt relevant, indeed of critical importance here, Derrida warns about a kind of hostility, indeed violence, inside hospitality so conceived. At the same time, we might also wonder whether all sorts of exclusions constitutive of a violence or a violation, and indeed whether they are all of the same order of offense. Might it not be a violation, perhaps even a greater violation, to not ask if some acts of exclusion could be enacted in the pursuit of justice to come rather than injustice? I'm thinking here of decolonial refusals of hospitality in efforts to resist the ongoing violence of settler colonialism, for example. So these are very large questions which we're not going to address here. I want to take up actually just one particular aspect of the question of multiplicity and differential force of various orders and kinds of violences of exclusion, and entertain the following question. Are not the acts of extreme violence that the passage by Johnson and Barker alludes to of a different order than those of which Derrida speaks, of filtering and choosing? The fact that the author's naming of acts of extreme violence is that of playing host is not merely ironic, but at once announces the questions of place and sovereignty, while at the same time calling into question the very notion of hospitality itself, at least figured in the classical sense, thereby revealing the irony at its core. If we follow Derrida on hospitality, he likens the important distinction between law and justice to that of conditional and unconditional hospitality, respectively. So unlike law, which is instrumentalized in terms of norms, interpretations, and calculations, he writes that justice is the experience of the incalculable, of having to calculate with the incalculable. It is at play in those singular moments where we cannot determine the outcome or just decision in a given situation, not only because there is no given rule to be applied, but because the rules in their very basis are in question. So justice is therefore always to come, avenir, which, as Derrida emphasizes in Force of Law, is not to say that we can therefore absolve ourselves from the responsibility to actively pursue justice. On the contrary, justice in the form of justice to come is an infinite pursuit, an ongoing ethical practice. Indeed, in this case, it is abundantly evident, I would suggest, explosively so, that the law is not an antidote to injustices, that legal redress is not only not sufficient to block or address the harm, but on the contrary, it is the law itself that is doing violence, but not merely by defining terms and giving interpretations, which is Derrida's focus, but rather by a legally sanctioned means of applying a force so great that it literally vaporized islands, producing in the extreme a form of dispossession and displacement we might call nuclear refugeeism. This is precisely the kind of material, indeed explosive violence of the law that I would suggest that Benjamin sets out to address in his critique of violence. This brings to the fore a crucial question: how hospitable is hospitality for addressing questions of violence, not merely the violence of choosing, but the unleashing of forces of nature? Indeed, these forces of violence are surely not of the same order, let alone of the same magnitude. So, and we're going to talk tomorrow, as we mentioned, about Derrida's paper called No Apocalypse, which is an engagement with questions of nuclear war and its possibilities. And there's a striking engagement with Derrida on these questions where he talks about the way in which there's a fiction and a kind of fantasizing about nuclear war. And I would say that if the dropping of 2,000 atomic bombs, mostly on indigenous peoples around the globe, is not no nuclear war, I don't know when we're going to find one. So this, everybody knows I really like to think with Derrida in a materialist fashion, but there were points of really places that seem like one really has to push Derrida from a certain kind of way of figuring these things. So it's part of what's up in this paper. So this brings us back around to the sentence we've been focusing on that has the U.S. territory playing the host to the guests who are the nuclear bombs. So surely this is an ironic turn of phrase, a purposeful displacement and grotesque distortion of the actual historical host-guest relationship entailed in what is also nothing less than a deep perversion of the notion of hospitality. For was it not the Marshallese people whose hospitality goes unmentioned, and yet at the same time is forcibly performed for the world in staged newsreels made by the U.S. Navy? As Jeffrey Sasha Davis points out, quote, the Bikinians were asked, that is forced, to leave their island, quote unquote, for the good of mankind. At the same time, the Bikinians' removal, the U.S. Navy and U.S. media constructed the Bikinians as primitive nomadic people living in nature who could legitimately be moved to any other natural atoll. This labeling of the atoll as natural served to erase the social history of the Bikinian people in their place. So the question of hospitality is far from beside the point, and yet it leaves us with the crucial question: how can we take account of the aporia of hospitality so that it meaningfully addresses a situation such as this, where violence is not about choosing and filtering, but where a great force of nature has been unleashed? This is surely not to dismiss Derrida out of hand. Derrida's stakes in raising this question are quite high. It is in the context of his discussions of immigration, political asylum, statelessness, deportation, incarceration, refugeeism, xenophobia, and nationalism that Derrida asks if hospitality is possible and what it might mean. So surely these issues are not, surely these issues could not be more important at this moment of time robustly entangled as they are to nuclear and climate issues. We are here at the crossroads, as has so often been the case. Indeed, when has it not? And yet, we can see from this example that the question of hospitality, if it is to constitute an accounting of the incalculability of justice, must be asked in relation to the material nature of forces in their differential materiality, including those that literally blow worlds apart. This next section is called Quantum Physics and Entangled Relations of Responsibility. Significantly, the Marshallese refused the name dome and have named this concrete structure the tomb. Tombs contain one's ancestors. This tomb contains and doesn't contain the future as well as the past. It marks an untimeliness, a time out of joint. The structure of this covered over void, blasted into a so-called void, is a hauntology, an inheritance of practices of erasure and avoidance. This nothingness is flush with alchemical wanderings, the infinite, ongoing, reiterative transformations of time being. While hauntings are understood by some as one or another form of subjective human experience, the epistemological revivifications of the past, a recollection through which the past makes itself subjectively present, according to quantum field theory, hauntings are material. They are lively indeterminacies of time being, constitutive of matter itself, indeed of everything and nothing in their inseparability. Hauntings, then, are not mere rememberings of a past assumed to be left behind in actuality, but rather the dynamism of ontological indeterminacy of time being in its materiality. Furthermore, as I have elaborated in a paper entitled Troubling Times and Ecologies of Nothingness, Returning, Remembering, and Facing the Incalculable, which sets out to explore justice to come as a material set of impossibilities within and of the world, an embodied practice of tracing the entanglements of violent histories, I argued that the face of colonial practices of erasure and avoidance, such as those we find in the histories and ongoing lived realities of violence that entangle Nagasaki to the indigenous lands of the U.S. Southwest, the pursuit of justice entails an embodied practice of remembering, which is not about going back to what was, but rather about the material reconfigurings of space-time mattering, in ways that attempt to do justice to account for the devastation wrought, as well as to produce openings, new possibilities, new possible histories by which time being might find a way to endure. In my continuing project to bring forward the radical possibilities for living being otherwise that are always already within quantum physics, I have also written about quantum entanglements in relation to hauntological relations of inheritance. And it's worth keeping these key points concerning material questions of justice when we turn our attention back to hospitality in light of the insights that we have learned about quantum field theory. So I just want to quote from a paper that I published in 2010 in Derrida Today. Only by facing the ghosts in their materiality and acknowledging injustice without the empty promise of complete repair or making amends finally, can we come close to hearing the speaking silence of the ghosts. The past is never closed, never finished once and for all, but there is no taking back, setting time aright, putting the world back on its axis. There is no erasure of past violences finally. The trace of all reconfigurings are written into the iterative, enfolded materializations of what was, is to come. Time can't be fixed. To address the past and the future, to speak with ghosts, is not to entertain or reconstruct some narrative of the way it was, but to respond, to be responsible, to take responsibility for that which we inherit from the past and the future, for the entangled relations of inheritance that we are, to acknowledge and be responsive to the non-contemporaneity of the present, to put oneself at risk, to risk oneself, which is never one or self, to open oneself up to indeterminacy and moving towards what is to come. Only in this ongoing responsibility to the entangled other, without dismissal, without enough already, is there the possibility of justice to come. So now I'm coming to the concluding section, which isn't to say that I'm almost done. So this concluding section is called Radical Hospitality and the Material Force of Justice. So let's return to the dome. A slab of concrete covering over a void that was blasted into the midst of a void. That is, it was a void in the eyes of the US government, which viewed the Marshall Islands as, quote unquote, uninhabited or nearly so. An untouched paradise marked as infinitely distant from the modern technological world in space and in time. Then there is the void created by the detonation of a nuclear bomb, a crater, a bit of nothingness blasted into the void that is the island of Ruinit. A void within a void. And then there is the literal cover-up, the pouring of concrete on top of the void, a conscious attempt of avoidance of responsibility, following on the heels of the dumping of plutonium and other radioactive materials into the void. Uninhabitability, inhabiting the uninhabited, a tomb inhabited by ghosts. This covering over, this attempt to dress up the naked infinities of the layering of violence upon violence, the incalculable brutality of superpositions of nuclear and climate catastrophes, the effects of militarism, colonialism, nationalism, scientism, modernism, racism, and capitalism speaks to the specific structures of nothingness in their entanglement. In this case, a void within a void at the end of the earth in space that signals the end of the earth in time. Colonialism often finds its justification in terms of the void, that which is deemed uninhabited, or as Sylvia Wynter would put it, uninhabitable, with its alleged invitation to colonial habitation or uninhabitability for the colonized, as the case may be, and the consequent avoidance of responsibility. Radioactive colonialism manufactured in the form of a structured nothingness, a nothingness alive with ghosts, an island void whose non-human inhabitants include pieces of a bomb that broke with its violent inheritance by breaking itself apart rather than exploding on command, live inside this creator, that's interesting slip, live inside this crater that its kin created. Questions of cohabitation coexist and cohabit with those of uninhabitability, a strange hospitality. Which brings us back around to the question raised earlier, how hospitable is hospitality? And its deconstruction for addressing questions of violence, not merely the violence of choosing, delineating, interpreting, and defining on behalf of the law, but the extreme violence entailed in unleashing forces of nature. Derrida, in On Hospitality, deconstructs the juridical, aka conditional notion of hospitality, and in particular, its foundation in notions of property and the sovereign self. That is, he demonstrates how a notion of hospitality founded on these Eurocentric notions of self and relatedly that of property entails their undoing. So I hope you guys are already I'm giving you hints here where I'm going from our conversation. So perhaps one of the most telling sentences that Derrida writes about hospitality is in the form of a question: is not hospitality an interruption of the self? Echoing perhaps the bomb's interruption of itself. The self is constituted through the incorporation of the other within the self. The other interrupts and it erupts within, through, and as the constitution and deconstitution of the self. Turning to Emmanuel Levinas to further articulate this point, Derrida writes, because it opens itself to, so as to welcome, the eruption of the idea of infinity in the finite, this metaphysics is an experience of hospitality, unquote. Well then, is this not precisely what we learned that quantum field theory says of matter itself? Is not matter a matter of hospitality in its very constitution, in its very undoing of itself? Is there not an eruption of the infinite within the finite, an intrusion of an unlimited number of unknown others to an unlimited extent, such that the nature of matter entails in its very structure the undoing of identity, individuality, essence? According to quantum field theory, there is no avoiding the fact that the void is far from empty. Indeed, nothingness is an infinite plenitude, not a thing, but a dynamic of ontological indeterminacy that cannot be disentangled from what matters. Hence, according to quantum field theory, even the smallest bits of matter are an enormous multitude. Each individual, each so-called individual, is made up of all possible histories of virtual interactions with all others, or rather, according to quantum field theory, there is no such thing as a discrete individual with its own roster of properties. In fact, the other, the constitutively excluded, is always already within. The very notion of the self is a troubling of the interior-exterior distinction. Matter, in the indeterminacy of its being, undoes identity and unsettles the very foundations of non-being. Together with Derrida, we might then say identity can only affirm itself as identity to itself by opening itself to the hospitality of a difference from itself or a difference with itself. Condition of the self, such a difference from and with itself would then be its very thing, the stranger at home. So let's return to the dome. Sorry. Lost a page or something here. Oh, here it is. Problem with two-sided printing. So what is being called into question here is the very nature of the self. All selves are not themselves, but rather the iterative interactivity of all matter of time beings. The self is dispersed, diffracted through being and time, and in an undoing of the inside-outside distinction, it is undecidable whether there is an implosion of otherness within or a dispersion, explosion of the self through space-time mattering. Well, for Levinas, the stakes are the ethical constitution of the human subject, quote-unquote, submitting subjection to the idea of infinity in the finite, unquote. What we find here is that this structure of hospitality is a matter of the very nature of matter itself, in an undoing of it and self, and not limited to the human. Indeed, in an important sense, this structured relationality precedes the differential constitution of human in opposition to some others. In other words, what is at issue here is not a matter of extending the range of Levinas's thinking or his conclusions to the non-human or otherwise than human, but rather it is in the very nature of nature's radical hospitality that the constitutive outside interrupts and erupts within the self, and this dynamism of ontological indeterminacy precedes and undoes any delineation, including that of the human. In an important sense, then, a notion of radical hospitality coming through quantum field theory breaks open not only some alleged pre-existing distinction between the human and its others, but also the very walls of deconstruction's circumscription within the limits of discourse. For as Derrida writes in Force of Law, quote, discourse here meets its limit in itself, in its very performative power. There is here a silence walled up in the violent structure of the founding act, walled up, walled in, because this silence is not exterior to language, unquote. So not only does the dynamism of indeterminacy undo any such walling up or walling in, but it is always already in touch with matter, or rather, it is matter in its inseparability from this speaking silence of the void, not some walled-in silence, full stop. The fact that the structure of hospitality is not limited to the human, but rather is in the very nature of nature is vitally important, for it means that the self, or shall we say itself, which is not itself, is not merely interrupted by human others, but also by a host of other others, including the ontological relations of inheritance and the ontological wanderings of nothingness. In the example we've been discussing, this would include the eruptions of the forces of capitalism, colonialism, militarism, etc., but also an infinite set of possibilities for their undoing. This is no small matter. Inside the nucleus of an atom is an implosion of violent legacies, sedimenting historicities of colonialism, racism, extractivist capitalism, militarism, neo-colonialism, and also the seeds of their downfall and the possibilities for living and dying otherwise. The classical Newtonian notion of the void might have served as a much valued apparatus in the service of colonialism, but according to quantum field theory, the void is not the background against which something happens, something matters, something appears, but rather an active constitutive part of everything. And as such, even the smallest bits of matter are haunted by, indeed constituted by, the indeterminate alchemical wanderings of an infinity of possible time beings, a radical hospitality, an unlimited number of unknown others to an unlimited extent, unquote. So according to quantum field theory, matter is an ongoing transmutation, an undoing of self, of identity, where the other is always already within. Matter is a matter of hospitality, the possibility, impossibility of radical hospitality in its very constitution, in its very undoing of itself. Final paragraph. Each bit of matter, each moment of space-time mattering is shot through with an infinite set of impossibilities for materially reconfiguring worlds and past, present, futures. Surely these matters are nothing less than matters of justice. Is matter's undoing not the mark of the force of justice that is written into the fabric of the world? Which is not to say that the world is always already just by its very nature, but rather to say that there is a force of justice that is available within every moment, every place, every bit of matter. For therein lies the infinite possibilities for defeating the entangled forces of violence and for imagining and bringing forth what comes after the end of the world, that is, in the aftermath of the downfall of a multitude of entangled structures of violence that must be brought to an end. Thank you.